There are several places in history which are worth talking about. One of them is Burkina Faso. You never hear anything about it because obviously it represents two things that are crazy. Firstly, it represents a change in history for Africa. As you can see, these giant structures or these sort of termite mound looking structures are actually made from clay and they're there to build or to create iron. Now, I've talked about these before, but we don't need to get into deep details into the iron creation. What's more important is that 300 BC, you have evidence of stone structures in Burkina Faso, but it is not believed by archaeologists that they are the earliest in Africa. In fact, it's now thought that some of the earliest stone structures might come from as early as any other civilization in history. They might even go as far back as Göbekli Tepe or Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Almost everything that was around in Çatalhöyük or in Göbekli Tepe was around in West Africa at about the same time, 8000 BC. I'm talking about cattle, I'm talking about domestication, I'm talking about all of this stuff. In fact, it's even thought that at one point the domestication in Africa was earlier than that of Turkey. But let's fast forward to 300 BC. 300 BC is the earliest evidence that we have of actual stones that have been carbon dated, although the entire site in Burkina Faso is completely neglected in terms of study. This is taken from the University of Michigan and it reflects mud bricks that were from about 500 BC. At least that is the oldest that they can date it, that is suggested by the evidence. The site is in Girigongo, which is not in Congo. Anybody who thinks that it's in Congo, it's not in Congo, it's in Burkina Faso, and it reflects one of the oldest ever discovered places. In fact, we shall read from the university what they say. Archaeological evidence suggests that 500 BC, sedentary food producing societies began to settle into villages and towns throughout the savanna zone of West Africa. McIntosh 1994, Bruning, and Newman in 2002. However, little is known of their socio and political organization, based in a wider anthropological debate on the organizational nature of the complex societies in sub-Saharan Africa. Fortes and Evans pictured in 94 or 1940 and Southhold 1956. Recent archaeological research has offered some plim, uh, preliminary understanding of the organizational features of more complex late prehistoric societies. This work has documented a variety of socio-political forms based upon a diverse material record. However, this work has been mainly centered on urban sites located along the major river drainage systems of West Africa. The Senegal, Gambia, and Niger rivers and the Lake Chad basin, relatively little attention has been focused on studying the basin, the basic organizational mechanisms that allowed for initial sedentary life and are seen as foundational to the integration and growth of a larger social groupings. I don't want to get into other things that they talk about. So let's skip and go straight to where we talk about. So a 3 by 3 meter test unit was excavated at Mound 1. The location was chosen for two reasons. First, the height of the 3.5 mound suggested a long occupational history, and second, the mound is in danger of destruction due to the proximity to the road. The unit exhibited excellent preservation of various classes of materials. Since an aim of the project is to discriminate various social units at the site, preservation is essential for isolating key spatial variation as well as for a detailed analysis of socio-economic data. Parts of six superimposed household compounds, brick walls stood 20 to 30 centimeters high, and measurements on individual bricks were possible. Materials were collected according to various spatial contexts within each compound. For example, it was possible to sample a paved interior courtyard and three different mud brick structures in compound 3. The excellent architectural preservation was mirrored in manufactured objects and subsistence remains or subsistence remains. All deposits were screened and flotation samples were taken from all primary contexts. Preliminary analysis of substance data, botanical and faunal, are currently underway to characterize the economy. According to the university, this place was abandoned around 1400 AD. Now, the interesting thing about this is that a lot of great kingdoms in Africa start about that date, about 1400 AD. And that's why I find it fascinating that this place right here is one of the least known when it's one of the oldest in Africa. When people start talking about Mali and they start talking about all these other places, they're really talking about later foundations. Even the Telem, who created, I mean, crazy pottery, even they were not as old as these people. We need to look into these people's food, into their lifestyle, into everything as suggested by this university. But first, I want to go back to something that I've talked about a lot, and I want to go back to those images from Chad and just above West Africa in the plateau in Tassili Najar. And I want to make sure that when I talk about this, I specify. You see here, this is a chameleon. Now, it's easy to tell that it's a chameleon, but there's something extra going on, which is if you see there, there's a bunch of geometric patterns all around the body, all around the head, and even the head is a geometric shape, and the tail. Now, it's hard for me to explain from just cave paintings that what's possibly happening is that they're doing geometric patterns. They're trying to preserve geometric patterns. But once I show you these ones, it makes it easier to explain that. We can see from masks that are close by that they, I don't know, compromise the way that the mask is supposed to look in order to preserve this appearance. In fact, something that I didn't even consider until this very moment is those things might be representing masks, even though I think they're probably representing geometric patterns and nature and all that other stuff. Perhaps I'm putting two things together that don't match, but let's just go with it for now and see. So you see over there, what we have is the very old cave paintings. This is possibly from about 5000 BC. On that's written in digital photograph, that cave painting. And what are we looking at on this side? Well, what we're looking at this side is a female who head almost morphs with their hair, and it almost doesn't represent real hair. I mean, you can see it's kind of like a mohawk of some kind, but clearly it's to show some kind of squares and circles and all of that geometric patterns. Clearly they're being more respected than the actual shape of the human. And this might have come from the cave painting, or it might have just been something that was there in the history that just continued forever. And remember, this is what you get when you go to South Africa. This is what you get when you go to Ethiopia. This is what you get when you go to Congo or any other place in Africa, geometric patterns revealing humanoid figures. In fact, in some cases, there is no human. Remember the line drawings I showed you on the sand? In some cases, there you without somebody telling you, you cannot tell. When put next to these prehistoric figures, when you see this historic figure, because by the time this existed, they could write in Arabic scripts, whether of African origin or not. But you could see over here that the shape is the same of the heads, that mushroomy shape, and you can see there's a bunch of circles inside. And then you can see on this side they have the same sort of mushroomy shape and different cut in geometric symbols on the inside, almost maze like. And if you look at the one in the middle, you look at it, triangles, this mushroom shaped head that you saw with the chameleon as well, these triangles on the middle of the body. And of course, some people call this the phallic symbol, when they don't have a body. They sort of somewhat resemble a phallic symbol. And it's also possible that, of course, the head, the way it's made, is ooh. It's also possible that the head, the way it's made, is supposed to represent a phallic symbol, maybe signifying that that is a male. Because you can see in the first one that the three women that are represented at the bottom, they don't look like these dudes. The dudes at the top have that type of head, and maybe that's to separate between a man and a woman. I mean, it's possible. Continuing with Burkina Faso, these are the ruins of Loropeni. And the oldest they could be is about the 14th century, but it's thought that they might go back even further than that. But evidence is still being collected. These ruins of the Loropeni people show that there was gold. They were trading gold and they were trading with a whole bunch of other stuff. In fact, it's thought that it's about this time that you start seeing northern Berbers moving into these regions more and more. Unlike the previous ones where we see rocks that are on the ground, these ones are actually a little higher. Well, way higher. You can see the trees can barely look over this wall. And this history is probably a continuation of that earlier Burkina Faso site. Now, if this is true, then we can see that they have a similar style in circlage, and these things do remind me of what we would later see in Great Zimbabwe and all these other places. The key word in Africa at this time is not necessarily house, but enclosure. It seems like we learned from cattle that you enclose things that belong to you rather than house them. And so you see, if you look at Great Zimbabwe, you look at Mozambique, you look at Mapungubwe, you look at all these other places, more than the focus on houses, they focus on enclosures, stone enclosures that close the community together. And then in between that, they'll have like bricked houses with thatched roofs. Like they don't necessarily care about the sophistication of that part, because once you've closed out the people, it's almost like, imagine if instead of having a brick house, you have a brick wall where people can't pass, and then inside that wall you have a bunch of other maze like walls, and then right in the middle you have a house that's made of a softer material. Now, the difference between these ones and other East African kingdoms is that they are mortared together. This mortar that's used here is also used in that very early one that we read. Now, from UNESCO, we read the dates. I said 14th century because that's the first date I read, but this is from UNESCO. The dramatic and memorable ruins of Lorobeni consist of imposing tall lateral stone perimeter walls, up to 6 meters in height, surrounding a large abandoned settlement as the best preserved of 10 similar fortresses in the Lobai region. Part of the larger group of around 100 stone built enclosures, they are part of a network of settlements that flourished at the same time as the trans Saharan gold trade and appear to reflect the power and influence of that trade and its link with the Atlantic coast. Recent excavations have provided radiocarbon dates suggesting the walled enclosure at Lorobeni dates back at least to the 11th century AD and flourished between the 14th century and the 17th centuries, thus establishing it as an important part of the networks of settlements. Now, I want us to take that in, all of us, but we must remember that at this time in the 11th century, we have a bunch of kingdoms in Africa that represent everything that's there: a walled enclosure, some forms of writing, trade, gold. I mean, honestly, this is just another African kingdom. But here's the scary part: Burkina Faso is not exactly one of the most well known countries, even though it has one of the best histories in the world, really. I mean, I was just going to say Africa, but if you consider the fact that we were trading with places like Oceania, which is the Australian regions, if you consider the fact that we were trading with the Middle East, the Mediterranean, everywhere at the time, and still remaining true to who we are, come on. Now, for some reason, there are hundreds, no, thousands of depictions of chameleons in both the Burkina Faso, the Amazigh, the South African, the Nigerian, and all these places. Now, the chameleon is thought to be the communicator between the sky and the ground, meaning, and by the way, there's no real reason to assume this naturally. A communicator between the sky and the ground would be a bird, right? Like, because it flies into the sky and comes back to the ground. In fact, a lot of African traditions have the bird as the first and sometimes a spider, and it gets replaced by a chameleon. Now, I don't know why they use a chameleon, but I do know that it is in most religions in Africa. Not most religions, but most areas in Africa have a religion that has a chameleon somewhere. And they are depicted in some very interesting ways. I mean, if you looked at the Amazigh one, if you look at this one, which is Burkina Faso version, if you look at all of these places, you will see that there is great detail taken to this animal. One, it's thought to be smart. Two, it's thought to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Slow. But it's also thought to be silent or inconspicuous, making it a unexpected but useful animal in history. Now, interestingly, Africans don't really focus that much on its ability to change color. Instead, they focus on it curling of its tail and patterns that are represented on it, which represent different worlds and entering different cycles of different cults and stuff like that. But you almost never see them talking about, oh yeah, it has this color and that color represents this. You start seeing this from people outside of Africa. The people who ruled the Burkina Faso regions would continue even in the Islamic days, about 15th century, and then they would continue up until today, really. As you can see, I mean, they still hold the traditions, and this hat they're wearing looks very similar to that chameleon head that they have, and it's not a new style they're doing. And even remember the mohawks that we saw there, possibly representing this. This is not something new to these people. But something that is untouched about them, something that is, I don't know, unique about them is everything, really. It's Burkina Faso seems to be in the perfect place where it's taking pieces from every side, and somehow it doesn't look like it's taking it from every side. So from North Africa, it's taking, I mean, so many things. I don't even know where to start. But iron is right there. Cotton seems to be there. Shells, they seem to be there. Pottery from West Africa. All these things that just were always there. But we'll talk about the Islamic empires that came and changed the entire game, like the Mali or the Congo. Now remember, this Congo I'm talking about is a Muslim empire. It's not the Kingdom of Congo, which was a Christian empire.